Continuing with the Apex Legends characters, here's the group picture so far, and at the end of the last video, the wheel decided that the next character to do will be Mirage. This is a character I've been looking forward to for a while, mainly because of his center of attention position in the group picture, and I thought he wouldn't need too many accessories. I started by deciding on his accessories and quickly discovered that he needed quite a few of them. I added these two scarf pieces so I could overlay them and erase one over the other to create the checkered pattern. I added 3 of these snorkel goggle pieces because I needed the orange for the visor and a darker outside, but I wasn't sure whether to go for black or dark bluish grey, so I just took both to experiment. And I imported 5 hair pieces and eventually decided to just use this one as the base and only the fringe from this one. These accessories needed a lot of adjustment in the Photoshop stage, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Continuing with the face print, I used an episode 5 Han Solo as the base because I remembered Han's smirk and thought it was the perfect base for Mirage. I squinted his eyes, inverted his mouth, added 2 small lines for his teeth, and changed the colour of his eyebrows before adding his beard and scar details. I also added some light bluish grey details for his beard just because I thought it looked a little flat. This is adding a bit too much detail honestly, but I'll talk more about that when I get to the leg print. But beyond that, I coloured his scars a sand red colour, which I think worked perfectly, and that was his face done. I actually do have something to say about his torso print this time. The biggest decision I made here was printing his belt so high up on the torso as opposed to on his waist print where it normally would be. As you can see in this rough proportion guide sketch, I plan to have all of the waist piece act as just the yellow part of his legs, with the grey part starting on his leg. In general, I thought his legs had a lot of detail in a small area, so I thought moving the belt higher up would clear that space while also filling an otherwise blank area with some detail. I also deliberately oversized the print for that stitch work on his stomach area because I thought it was a cool detail, and I liked the colour balance more with some islands of white in the middle there. Beyond that, I added some scarf printing onto his torso print too because it felt right and would connect nicely with the physical pieces, and with that, the torso was done. Following the proportion plan from earlier, my original plan was to have the waist print just be these lines connecting the belt to the legs, but after seeing it on the figure, I thought that section was way too long and it just looked weird. So I essentially started from scratch again and pushed the leg print up into the waist a little. I think this was a great decision because the leg prints did end up pretty cramped and it really needed this extra space, and I just think this really improved the overall proportions of the finished figure's prints. I started the print for the legs actually pretty far down the leg. This is because I noticed that the top of the prints always end up hidden in the curved area under the waist when I print too high up on the UV, and I really wanted this to connect to the waist properly, so I really squished it down. I think because of this there was a lot of detail really crammed in there, but it worked out well and I like how it looks. His left leg needed quite a few adjustments beyond the usual copy and paste. His knee pad needed changing, and pretty much every detail from that area and above was different. My original plan was to do full side leg printing here, but ultimately I think that black and yellow checkered flag detail wasn't important enough to warrant all of the side leg printing, so I just alluded to it in the front and left it at that. After looking at the leg prints on the figure, I think I finally hit my limit on how detailed these prints can be. Specifically looking at the dark bluish grey line work on these leg prints, I just thought they were so unnecessarily thin, so I actually went back and filled in the gaps between them to create one thicker outline, while also erasing some small grey scuff marks. His arm print took a lot of time and had a lot of detail to consider. For some reason, just freehand drawing perfect circles is super difficult. If only there was some tool in Photoshop that could create them for you. Oh well, I guess the technology just isn't there yet. Beyond that, there was a lot of detail crammed into a small area and a lot of line work to clipping mask over. His other arm was a copy and paste job for the most part, but required some small changes in the form of 2 white bands and a slight recolor. These arms took a lot of effort, and I'm delighted to announce that neither were visible pretty much at all on the finished pose, so it was all just a waste of time. I think in the future I need to do the pose before the arm prints because it's always the arm prints that get hidden, and I simply cannot make this mistake again. Speaking of the pose, this one was actually pretty fun because it's a surprisingly natural pose. Like, you could almost replicate it from memory, if that makes sense. With that said, the limitations of the Mechafig extension came into play again in a few ways, and I had to make a few compromises. Firstly, the right leg remained visible under his left one. This was just because I think it looks better and the leg piece couldn't really bend that strongly without heavily distorting the print, so I just left it as is. Second compromise was his right arm. Again, I just didn't have the mobility in that shoulder joint to have it bend fully to have his head lean on it. This was something I fixed in Photoshop after the fact, but still annoying. Third thing was his other arm and how, again, the Mechafig extension just doesn't allow me to bend his arm in the way shown in the reference. This is super annoying, honestly, and I wasn't really bothered to do the same HDRI rotation trick as I did with Ballistic, so I just bent his wrist as much as possible and left it there. And the last compromise was the gun accessory. Lego weapons are super oversized, and even the smallest pistol in his hand still had the effect of covering almost his entire torso print. I really didn't like that because the pistol isn't something that deserves to be highlighted that much, so I ended up scaling it down pretty dramatically ergonomically and having him hold it in such a way that it's barely covering any of the torso print. The only part it ended up covering was the pouch detail just above his waist, and honestly I'm okay with that because I thought it was the ugliest part of the print I made anyway, so this was a win-win solution. I then rendered him 11 times with various combinations of accessories. This was to give me as much options as possible when it came to colors, shapes, and which shadows to include or exclude in the Photoshop adjustment stage. I then loaded up all the renders into Photoshop and layered them on top of each other before doing my classic strat of erasing one layer to get that dual molded effect on the lower layers. I started with the wingman, which was simple enough in that I just removed the barrel from the front and adjusted the shadow underneath accordingly. I then removed the super bright glow that came in the render from the brighter scarf piece before fixing some clipping issues with that same piece. Did the same with the darker color. I then erased the brighter scarf from one layer in squares to get that checkered effect on the scarf. I blurred the lines in between them very slightly to make it look more like a dual molded piece. I was very satisfied with how well it worked with the continuation on the torso print too, so that was cool. Next was the visor, which was more of the same. I put the orange layer on top before erasing any parts that needed to be black. I also removed the snorkel attachment on the right side and the shadow cast over his face from the visor. I then shaped the hair to include the fringe hanging over the visor. This is my favorite part of the whole figure because it was pretty simple to do, worked pretty seamlessly, and very quickly revealed the final figure, which was really cool to see come together like that. Like, this was the last probably 15 minutes or so of a 9 or 10 hour project, and it's really cool to see the result right at the end like that when you were just trusting the process up until that point. I also adjusted the arm to actually be supporting his head, which was also handy enough, before adding some light bluish grey colours to the wingman, and with that, there you go, the final figure. It's not a perfect one-to-one with the reference, and I guess I could have continued the print around the inside of his right arm too to get those armband details in, but I'm pretty happy with how it turned out anyway, especially his face and head details. And now we spin the wheel to see who's next. Annoyingly, they decided to remake Revenant for season 18, so I guess my Revenant figure is now outdated. This was a pretty shit thing to find out. I would have ignored it completely, but since this dude asked, I guess I'll add him back to the wheel, but I'm not happy about it. Anyway, let's see. Okay. This was one of the ones I was dreading.